This week's geopolitical briefing leads with the re-escalation in the Gulf, renewed US-Iran hostilities, tanker attacks in the Strait of Hormuz, and a reinstated US naval blockade that's already moving oil prices and shipping insurance. Also, Trump's speech, which appears to be a distraction away from his Middle East quagmire. Part 1. Gulf Flashpoint. Tankers, missiles, and the Hormuz choke point. This week in the Gulf, the situation has sharpened significantly. 2 UAE-flagged oil tankers were struck by Iranian cruise missiles in the Strait of Hormuz, killing 1 crew member and injuring 8 others. In response, the US has resumed airstrikes on Iranian military infrastructure and announced a naval blockade on Iranian ports, effective July 15th. Oil prices jumped nearly 10% on the news, and shipping companies are recalculating routes and insurance costs. Trump has said publicly that a deal is still possible, even as military operations continue, a pattern we've seen before. Escalation paired with openness to negotiation. The alternative perspective. At a system level, the Gulf is functioning as a pressure valve and a leverage point. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical choke points. Roughly a fifth of global oil supply passes through it. When that choke point is threatened, the entire system reacts. Energy prices spike, inflation expectations shift, central banks recalibrate, and political narratives harden. But there's also a structural beneficiaries layer. Defense contractors, energy traders, insurance firms, and security providers all benefit from a sustained, high-risk environment. The question is always, who profits from the volatility and who absorbs the cost? Part 2. Trump's speech. Theater and misdirection. This week, Trump delivered a high-visibility speech that dominated cable news cycles and social media feeds. The speech touched on familiar themes: economic strength, law and order, America First rhetoric, and a push of the narrative of election rigging. The alternative perspective. Here's the timing question worth asking. The speech lands the same week the Gulf crisis reignites, oil spikes, and the US is actively conducting airstrikes on Iranian military targets. That's not necessarily an accident. High-decibel political theater is one of the oldest tools in the playbook for managing attention. When you want to keep a military escalation from becoming the dominant story, you create a competing narrative that's louder, more emotionally charged, and easier to digest. The speech doesn't have to be about the Middle East directly. It just has to be about something else that's loud enough to pull the oxygen out of the room. From a systems view, this is how wartime narratives are managed, not through censorship, but through saturation. Flood the zone with a different story, and the war continues in the background with less scrutiny, less pressure, and fewer demands for off-ramps. Part 3. G7 Fallout. The June summit's long shadow. The G7 summit in Évian, France happened in mid-June, not this week. But its fallout is still unfolding. The summit focused on Ukraine, AI governance, economic coordination, and how to handle China without triggering a full break. What emerged was not unity, but a clearer picture of the fractures. Different members signaling different levels of commitment to Ukraine, different appetites for confrontation with China, and different domestic political constraints. The alternative perspective. The G7 is becoming less a decision-making body and more a narrative battlefield. The communiques and group photos project cohesion, but the real alignment is fragmenting. Each capital is optimizing for its own survival. Domestic politics, economic pressures, energy security. The rules-based order language remains, but the underlying consensus is eroding. What you're seeing is the transition from a unipolar Western bloc to a multipolar system, where the G7 is one faction among several, not the commanding height. Part 4. US domestic crosscurrents. Enforcement and caution. Back in Washington, the political temperature remains high. The aftermath of the Massey primary in May is still echoing. Visible caution on foreign policy votes, noticeable shifts in how Republicans talk about Israel and foreign aid, and new primary challenges being telegraphed against members on both flanks. The enforcement mechanism is running. High-profile primaries, donor pressure, and media narratives are narrowing the acceptable range of dissent on key issues. The alternative perspective. What looks like internal party drama is actually structural tightening. The system is using targeted punishments to signal the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Senators like Rand Paul have already come in line with Trump's policy to maintain their roles in American politics. You can perform outrage on culture war issues, but when it comes to the core levers, military spending, alliance commitments, financial architecture, the tolerance for deviation is minimal. The message is consistent. Stay within the lanes that keep the empire's plumbing intact, or expect a well-funded challenger in your next primary. Part 5. Lindsey Graham, Death and the Power Vacuum. Senator Lindsey Graham died on July 11th at age 71, from what his office described as a brief and sudden illness, later reported as an aortic dissection. He was one of the most visible Republican voices on foreign policy, a constant presence on Sunday morning shows, and a reliable advocate for interventionist positions, more defense spending, harder lines on adversaries, and less tolerance for diplomatic off-ramps. His death comes at a moment when the Gulf is heating up, Ukraine aid is still being debated, and the Republican Party is navigating the tension between Trump's America First rhetoric and the traditional hawkish wing of the party. The alternative perspective, Graham's absence creates a structural void, not just a personal one. He was a connector between Trump and the Senate hawks, between the defense industry and the appropriations process, between the media and the foreign policy establishment. In the short term, expect a more muted, hawkish voice in the Senate. Graham was always available for a quote, always ready to push the narrative toward escalation. Without him, the most visible pressure for confrontation may ease, at least temporarily. But the system doesn't leave power vacuums unfilled. The question is whether his replacement is another hawk, or whether this becomes an opening for a different kind of Republican, one more aligned with the America First wing, or one more focused on domestic issues. Part 6. Global finance, bond yields, oil volatility, and the quiet stress test. In global markets, this week's moves are being driven by the Gulf situation. Oil volatility is the headline, but the quieter story is in bond yields and currency swings. Long-duration debt in several major economies is under pressure, and emerging market currencies tied to energy imports are showing stress. Central banks are caught between fighting inflation and avoiding a growth shock. The alternative perspective, bond markets are the nervous system of the global financial order. When yields move sharply, it's often a signal that confidence in the current policy mix is wavering. The stress test here is whether major central banks can still coordinate implicitly, or whether we're entering a phase where their priorities diverge enough to create real fragility. For ordinary people, this shows up as higher borrowing costs, more volatile asset prices, and a growing sense that the system is running with less and less buffer. In closing, here's what to keep an eye on this week. Any new strikes on energy infrastructure or shipping incidents in the Gulf, especially around the Strait of Hormuz and the UAE's ports. Oil price movements, and how quickly insurance premiums adjust to the new risk environment. Follow-up statements from G7 members on Ukraine, China, and trade that clarify who's aligning with whom after June's summit. Bond yield moves in the US, Europe, and Japan, and how central bankers talk about them in upcoming speeches. Concrete AI regulatory proposals coming out of G7 capitals, and which companies are already positioned to benefit. The alternative perspective, the key question is always, who benefits from the current configuration of risk? If the winners from this week's moves are the usual suspects, mega caps, defense contractors, big banks, and entrenched political elites, then you're looking at system maintenance, not system change. If you start to see shifts in who holds power, who gets access, and how risk is distributed, then this might be the early phase of a deeper reordering.